In a world full of noise, we're tuning in to what matters. Welcome to The Signal Room, a podcast where leadership, ethics, and innovation aren't buzzwords, they're blueprints. I'm Chris Hutchins, former Chief Data and Analytics Officer and host of the show. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Ratnadeep Bhattacharjee to the Signal Room podcast. Ratnadeep is the co-founder and managing director of Tech Variable, a leading healthcare IT firm specializing in AI-driven solutions, data integration, and digital transformation. With over a decade of experience as a techno-functional consultant, he's at the forefront of making organizations AI-ready, particularly in the U.S. healthcare sector, where his team develops innovative tools like SyncMesh, which you'll hear about a little bit today, for seamless data interoperability and predictive analytics. Ratnadeep's thought leadership shines through his podcasts, his articles, and insights on demystifying AI myths, ethical data strategies, and building data-mature cultures, perfectly aligning with our signal frequencies like the Enabler's Edge, which you'll learn about in coming episodes. Today, we'll dive into data readiness for AI adoption, ethical compliance in healthcare tech, and how his servant leadership empowers teams to gain a competitive edge. Ratnadeep, thanks for joining us. Let's unpack the signals shaping the future of data in health.
Sure, Chris. Looking forward.
As the co-founder and COO of Tech Variable, you've built a reputation for servant leadership, mentoring teams on essential AI skills like Python and Pandas while empowering non-tech stakeholders. How do you cultivate this enabler's edge to help organizations turn data challenges into competitive advantages in healthcare?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for that warm introduction, Chris. When I think about this idea of an enabler's edge, as you rightly put it, right? I don't necessarily see it as a title or a skill set. It's more of a mindset, right? And for me, that mindset really comes from being a non-technical founder in a very, very technical world, right? So, when you don't come from a hardcore coding background, you learn early on that your greatest strength is not in having all the answers, but in asking the right questions.
I love that.
Perspective has shaped how I lead. I don't walk into a room trying to prove I'm the smartest guy or an engineer there. I walk in, curious, eager to understand what challenges people are facing, and then I help connect the dots between technology and real world impact. In healthcare especially, this has been a gift because if you think about it, most of the stakeholders we work with, whether they are care coordinators, stakeholders from the payer systems, executives at provider organizations, they are not really deeply technical either, right? They care about outcomes, about how quickly data can help them identify, let's say care gaps, or how
Right.
an AI tool might reduce administrative burden. Being a non-tech founder allows me to naturally speak their language, if you know what I mean. I can translate between the technical depth of my team and the practical needs of the clients. And that bridge building is often where the real magic happens.
Right.
Now, within our own teams, I do spend time mentoring people, not because I'm the deepest expert, but because I want them to see how different skills connect to outcomes, right? How cleaning up
Right.
messy claims data can improve probably HEDIS reporting, or how building a good pipeline can make sure a Medicaid patient doesn't slip through the cracks. When people understand the why behind their technical skills, it kind of sticks, right? And that's
Right.
the non-tech perspective I bring. I constantly, anchor technical work in human purpose, right? So for me, cultivating this enabler's edge is about listening more than I speak, simplifying where
Right.
others complicate probably, and keeping the focus on people. That's what builds trust with teams, clients, and the entire ecosystem, right?
I love your approach to this, like listening more than you're talking. I couldn't agree with you more. But one of the interesting things I've encountered over the years is this interesting tendency that the technical teams and the project managers seem to want to explain the methodology. We're going to talk about Agile and Scrum and a few other things when our stakeholders and our business partners really care about when are we going to get what we've asked you to get for us. And the goofy things that sometimes we get hung up on are not the things that are important. It really is about, what it is that we're doing for the business and understanding the why so that we can actually connect with some purpose and deliver on what they're looking for.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit more and get into the readiness aspects of this, because what you've just talked about is certainly the very beginnings of that. So for diving into data readiness for AI adoption, in some of your writings and your podcast, I've heard you talk about the fact that 80 to 85% of organizations aren't prepared due to siloed data. Can you walk us through a practical data audit process and share how it separates real AI potential from hype?
That's a good question, Chris. As you rightly put, I often say that the real bottleneck in AI isn't the model or the algorithm, right? It's really the data. And the
Right.
reality, as you rightly put, especially even in healthcare, right? 80 to 85% of organizations simply aren't ready now. The data is siloed, across EHRs, across claims data, even
Mm-hmm.
spreadsheets. And unless you solve for that, AI ends up being more hype than help right now. I may not be a deeply technical founder, but that's actually helped me design a very simple, structured way about a data audit. I look at it in four lenses, and I try to explain it in plain language so that both technical and non-technical stakeholders can engage. The first lens is completeness. Do you
Right.
even have all the data you need? For example, if you're trying to build a care gap analytics model, but you only have claims data and no clinical notes, right? You are already flying half blind. Second is consistency. Even if the data is there, is it structured and standardized? I've seen organizations with 20 different ways of recording blood pressure or
Mm-hmm.
addresses that don't match across systems. In AI, especially in AI, actually, inconsistent data leads to inconsistent predictions. The third is connectivity. Are your data sources talking to each other? A patient's lab result might sit in one system, their
Mm-hmm.
prescription in another, social determinants in a third. Unless you connect these dots, AI can't really generate the view or the longitudinal view that really drives impact, right?
Right.
Fourth, and the obvious one would be compliance, right? In healthcare, this is
It's a big
non-negotiable.
one.
Is the data being used, in line with HIPAA, CMS mandates, or interoperability standards like FHIR? AI can't just be accurate, right? It has to be safe. It has to be ethical. Let me give you a quick example, Chris.
Great.
We recently worked with a small health plan serving Medicaid communities. They were very excited about AI and wanted to build predictive models for care gap closure, right? But
Mm-hmm.
when we did the audit, we found the real issue wasn't the AI, right? It was that their claims data and EHR fits weren't even talking to each other. Members would show up as non-compliant with screenings, simply because the screenings done at community clinics weren't reflected in the claims data. By fixing that connectivity and consistency issue, that they immediately improve the accuracy of their quality measures reporting, without even touching a single AI model, you see.
It's
Only
interesting.
after that.
What you're describing, I think, happens over and over again, and I think your approach is so important because having done these things before, you have an idea on what might be missing. Oftentimes, your business partners might not even have an idea. There's something out there they haven't seen. They don't know about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the reason, only after that foundation was in place did it make sense to even talk about advanced analytics, right? Chris, that's why I believe a data audit is so important, right? It separates the hype, you know,
Yes.
hype like let's deploy a generative AI chatbot tomorrow, from the reality. This is not a reality. We need to first, unify our patient data, ensure quality, and only then layer AI on top, right? Even only
Yes.
if it's really important. The organizations that succeed are the ones that treat data readiness as a journey, not really as a checkbox. They invest probably in getting the foundations right. And once that foundation is in place, AI will move or may move from being a
Right.
flashy experiment to being a strategic asset, right?
Yeah. I love how you're framing it, and I think the deliberate and methodical approach that you're taking is so important for people to hear. So I know you and I have had some exchanges on social media along with some other folks around this hidden cost that's causing really some significant challenges. It's really in this foundational layer where on top of everything, people think about technical debt because we invested in all these fantastic technologies. But there's a layer beneath that people haven't realized that if they haven't spent time securing that foundation and connecting all these silos, the technology is not going to do what they think it's going to do. And essentially, they might have just a really cool tech stack and some additional storage capacity, but no meaningful way to meet the objectives.
Absolutely.
So this
Absolutely.
kind of leads into another area that I think you guys have done a phenomenal job at designing meaningful tools, not for the sake of technology, but things that actually have purpose to really drive forward the objectives that you come to a consensus with when you set out to work with your clients. Real world tools. You have a platform called SyncMesh. It stands out as Tech Variable's platform for healthcare data integration. How does it enable features like a patient 360 view, claims automation like you've mentioned, or how does it make enterprises AI ready? And what's a standout use case study like predicting claims rejections that shows impacts on value-based care?
Okay, I'm glad that you brought that up, Chris, because SyncMesh is a great example of how we approach healthcare data integration at Tech Variable. But let me start off by clarifying something important. We don't position SyncMesh as a standalone product in the market. We rather position it as an accelerator, essentially, a set of pre-built frameworks, connectors, parsers, harmonizers that make our consulting and services delivery far more efficient and outcome driven,
Right.
right? In healthcare, the number one challenge is fragmentation. You have got patient data scattered across different systems, be it your EHR systems, claims data, pharmacies, even devices, right? And when the data doesn't flow together, it's nearly impossible to create what people call the patient 360 view. What SyncMesh kind of does is give us a head start in bringing all these pieces together. It accelerates the work of harmonizing data into a common schema, layering in interoperability standards like FHIR, and creating a
Mhm.
kind of a longitudinal view that's both actionable and compliant.
Right.
Now, once you have that kind of connected data backbone, a lot of things become possible. And this is where SyncMesh really shines, I believe. It takes care of the integration problem. It gives us a clean, unified, standard based
Mhm.
foundation of healthcare data. On top of that, our teams can build whatever the organization truly needs, right? A data warehouse, data lake, care gap
Right.
analytics solution, quality measures engine, or even ML models, for cohort creation for personalized intervention, right? In other words, SyncMesh doesn't try to be the end solution, clears the path so that higher value use cases can be built faster, more reliably, in a way that organizations genuinely become AI ready. Now, one of the important things to consider here, Chris, is
Mhm.
SyncMesh isn't the only arrow in our quiver, right?
Right.
We have built other accelerators too, pre-built data models for standing up a healthcare data warehouse
Mhm.
quickly, right? And no-code ETL frameworks, for faster data engineering, even a conversational Gen AI layer that sits on top of these warehouses and data lakes to make complex data more accessible to clinicians and business users. Together these accelerators mean we are not reinventing the wheel every time. We are solving for speed, reliability, and real world impact. Right? A very recent case study would be something that we did for a medical device company. They were collecting rich device generated data on patients, but it was siloed. The
Right.
EHR data set in one place, claims data in another, and none of it was being combined with the device data, right? So we deployed SyncMesh as
Yeah.
an integration layer, and then we unified those streams into a single patient record. So, that meant that care teams could see not just how the device was performing really, but how it got tied to actual patient outcomes and cost, right? So we could
Yeah.
identify patients who were at higher risk and where interventions were really needed, and predict care gaps as well, right? So that's the kind of transformation I'm excited about when you talk about sync mesh. We don't like to position it as something flashy, but something that really enables to become organizations AI ready in a very, very grounded way.
And this is such an important thing for people to understand, for our executive friends that are out there and hearing this conversation this morning. These foundational things, they're not the most visible parts of what we do, but it is absolutely one of the most critical and essential things that we can do. And when we put these kind of capabilities in the hands of our teams, it puts a significant amount of capability in front of them to accelerate, and their accuracy and the evolution and the way that it improves from the very first day you turn it on. It only gets better every time you use it. I think that's a really important thing for people to understand. There is a price of entry for these types of things that oftentimes it's just underappreciated because it is behind the scenes. The visualizations is what people are typically are drawn to. And it's certainly exciting when you get it right. But this hardwiring that has to be done in the foundational layer, it just can't be underestimated. It's a really, really important thing.
Oh, yes.
In your comments, you mentioned some things that are really important. So let's kind of jump over into the ethical use and compliance side of the world here. You mentioned HIPAA and FHIR and how these are evolving. How do you ensure things like sync mesh, navigate biases in predictive models, or privacy in data lakes? I think there's so much that you've already talked about where there's risk of things that just might not be known. They're not there. So how do we bake all of this into our approach, making sure that we are addressing these things ethically and responsibly?
That's such an important question, Chris. When we talk about AI in healthcare, the conversation, often gets swept up in potential, right? Like predictive models, personalization, automation.
Right.
But I believe, we have an equal responsibility to pause and ask, right? Are we building this responsibly? Is it compliant? Is it fair? Is it trustworthy? So let's start with compliance. Tools like SyncMesh was designed with guardrails, keeping HIPAA compliance, interoperability standards like FHIR in mind. These were not just afterthoughts, right? So what SyncMesh does is ensure that we are integrating EHR data, claims data, ADT feeds into a unified record, and that too very securely. We make sure that whenever we deploy it, we deploy it with proper access controls,
Right.
audit trails, de-identification, wherever necessary, right? So by solving these integration problems responsibly, it prevents a lot of these downstream risks that you talked about when the data is used in analytics, data lakes, AI pipelines. Then there's this issue of bias, right, in predictive models. In healthcare, bias isn't just a statistical problem. It can literally determine, who gets care and who doesn't. So our philosophy is that
Yeah.
bias has to be tackled at the data level first. That's where, accelerators like SyncMesh kind of plays a very important role. For example, if a model is trained only on claims data, it may miss key clinical or SDOH insights, right? But
Right.
when you bring those together, the picture becomes more representative and the model becomes more fairer, right?
Yes.
So compliance and bias checking are only half the story. The other half is you know leadership, right? And here's what I think, right? We need to build AI systems as if they are going to be audited tomorrow, not just by regulators,
Absolutely.
but by the very patients whose data is being used. That mindset would force you to prioritize transparency, document your process, involve diverse voices in the design stage, right? It also means that leaders would have to create cultures where, teams feel empowered to raise ethical concerns, not just technical ones.
Right.
So for me, the path to trustworthy AI or to trusting AI is about getting the foundations right,
Yes.
compliant data pipelines, vigilant check across against bias, and a leadership culture that values ethics as much as innovation, right? That's how
Right.
we make sure AI isn't just powerful, but also safe, equitable and worthy of trust.
This is so important in light of some very recent actions taken, like the California Assembly just passed some legislation that's requiring a level of transparency in how AI is being used for healthcare providers. This is something that's got to be addressed and enabled from the outset. And I love how you've described your process for auditing, because those are things that really do have to be baked in up front while you're putting the foundation in to enable you to be compliant and be transparent. Even the recent decision on Google, I think it was just yesterday. There's a movement here, and the push is going to be really about this transparency. It's less about addressing whether there's some sort of monopoly going on. It's making sure that things are even equitable across technology providers, healthcare providers, but it all comes back to the central mission that we're talking about in healthcare. And it's really about the patient and delivering the best possible care. And all the things that you're talking about, your technology, you've designed this already with this adaptability and flexibility so that when these legislative things come up, you and your clients are in perfect position to be able to be compliant and be ahead of the game. I really love how you've been thinking about this and how you're building. So as a leader, I've done my little bit of homework and looking at some of the things that I have found online. I've read some really interesting comments and heard commentary from others that have worked with you about your leadership style, which I understand is not something you are going to boast about, but I do have to ask you some questions because I think has really a lot to do with how much success you and your teams are having. What mentorship advice do you give leaders for building compliant, trustworthy AI systems in healthcare?
So, I mean, as you rightly put, I may not be a very technical founder. I may not be someone who can kind of recommend or advise someone. But what I would really say is, if you're building with AI in mind, just make sure that I mean, whatever you project yourself as is different, right? But what really comes to the fore is how you're building it, right? Because it's not just about you, right? Healthcare is a very subtle kind of a domain, right? Because
Right.
why I call it subtle is because it has a lot of intricacies to it. You're dealing with people's lives at the end of the day,
Yes.
right? And data, you have to make sure that whatever data goes into your models, whatever data that you are training the algorithm on, right, is top notch, right? You have to make sure that the data quality checks are in order, the data integration pieces are in order, and you have to make sure that it's not just the data quality, right? It's also the overall quality analytics and testing process of your entire product should be done in a way that makes it a product which can be trusted, right? It's not
Right.
just as I spoke to you about in my previous response as well, right? It's not just about bias and compliance. It's also about trusting the product that goes into the market, right?
Yes.
Success is one thing, but really creating a long lasting and product with a good legacy, that will only happen if you have a solid base or a foundation of the data infrastructure, right? So that's the
Yes.
only thing I would say.
And that's really a huge point for people to really grab a hold of. Trust is currency in the kind of work that you're talking about. And we really have to spend a lot more time thinking about how do we ensure what we're delivering can be trusted. Uh, there's always the unknowns that are part of the biases that are really concerning. What is it that we don't know and how important is it? These are things that face caregivers and clinicians on a daily basis. AI is not going to plug that gap for us. So we have to take the steps and have the flexibility in our approach to make sure that we're always making it as easy as possible to discover what else might be an important factor. So I love that. Focus on the trust, a little bit less on the technology, not meaning we're going to be sloppy, but the trust is foundational and it's got to be at the top of our priority list. So looking ahead as a guy who's got tremendous vision as a future builder, what bold trends like modular IT or no code pipelines are you pursuing to ethically scale AI in health? And how does enabling data maturity play into transformative outcomes for patients and providers?
Chris, when I think about the future of AI in healthcare, I try to look past the buzzwords and focus on what might really matter, which is scalability with trust, right? Because if we can't scale responsibly, we risk building these shiny pilots that never touch patients and patients' lives, let's say in a meaningful way. One bold trend I see is the move towards what I call data maturity as a service. Today
Right,
most organizations still think of data readiness as a one-off project, clean it once, integrate it once, and then move on to AI.
right.
But in reality, data is living, breathing, like constantly changing. Payers update policies, providers update systems, patients change
Yes,
their addresses. I believe the future is about treating data maturity as an ongoing capability, almost, like cloud infrastructure.
right.
The organizations that win, will be the ones that continuously monitor, reconcile, and improve their data pipelines so that AI has a trustworthy foundation every single day. The second big shift is around probably context aware AI. Right now most AI in healthcare is trained to perform a narrow task, predict readmissions, summarize a clinical note, or,
Right.
recommend interventions. But honestly, the real breakthroughs will come when AI systems can understand context across the patient journey. Imagine an AI tool that just doesn't flag that a patient is high risk, but
Mhm.
also understands the social, financial, and clinical context,
Right.
why they are such high risk and how best to intervene them. That kind of intelligence requires, good understanding of, what kind of data that is there as a foundational layer, right? And longitudinal records and stuff like that,
Mhm.
right?
So,
Third trend, yeah. So, Chris, the third trend possibly would be AI that reduces clinical burnout. I've been hearing this a lot
mm,
amongst healthcare leaders and especially the provider systems. We have seen, we have all seen how technology sometimes create more clicks than more dashboards and more cognitive load, right? I
yeah,
believe the next generation of healthcare AI must focus on ambient, visible experiences, systems kind of that work in the background, automate the mundane and surface only what truly matters. That's where our work on, conversational Gen AI layers sometimes I believe is important because, instead of training clinicians to adapt to the system should adapt to them. Finally,
yes,
uh, and one of the boldest trends of all is actually a cultural one. Ethics has to be by design.
right.
We can't bolt on compliance or fairness at the end. We have to understand that we need to embed ethics into every single stage of AI adoption, right? So yeah,
Right.
these are just my thoughts, initial thoughts, Chris.
Yeah, you're pointing out and emphasizing again something so important. These are things that have to be baked into our foundational layer as we're even starting out. And if you're already well into this and struggling, I'd encourage you to take a look at some of these areas and ask some questions. This may be some of the reason that you're struggling and you're not getting the answers you're looking for, which is why Ratnadeep and Tech Variable have been created, is to help to step into these areas to really help you identify where these gaps could be and really start stitching together all of these different silos so that you have the ability to start moving forward in these things. I think another point I want to make sure that our listeners here, particularly those who are in the decision making capacity where you've got a lot of financial responsibility. We like to think about these types of things as projects. And while setting things up to begin with might be a project, what Ratnadeep's been talking about is really building a foundation so that you're building a core competency into the DNA of your organization so that from this day forward, every day you get better information, you get more accurate, your workflows are getting refined, and you're providing even better decision support for your providers, and you're making them able to spend more time with the patient, maybe a few less clicks, less screen time. Giving back time is really something that is so important. And I've heard a common thread throughout your comments that it really is enabling that foundational activity to occur and reducing the friction in it. So I really, really appreciate what you've just described and what your thoughts and approaches are. To wrap up, what's one piece of actionable advice for listeners, perhaps aspiring enablers in data strategy, on fostering a culture where AI adoption empowers everyone, not just the experts?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chris. If I had to leave the audience, with just one piece of actionable advice, it would be this, right? Make AI everyone's conversation, not just the experts. Right? Too often, AI gets locked away in the data science lab, and the rest of the organization feels like passengers on a train. They probably didn't even buy tickets for. That's when adoption fails. The culture shift happens when you invite people in, when the care coordinator, claims processor, even the patient advocate feels like their voice matters in shaping how AI is used, right? You don't need them to understand the math behind a neural network probably,
Right.
but you do need them to share their, lived experiences of where the bottlenecks probably are, what frustrates them, what outcomes would really make a difference in their workflow. Because if AI doesn't solve these problems, it doesn't matter how advanced it is. It won't stick. As a non-tech founder, I've seen this firsthand. My role has often been to demystify the jargon, to
Right.
translate the technical into practical. And the beauty is when people understand the why and feel included in the how, they stop being resistant. Honestly, they become champions even. So, if you're someone who is an aspiring enabler, like in data strategy, start small, bring cross-functional voices probably in the room.
Right.
Start with simple questions. What part of your day probably feels like wasted effort. Where does data slow you down instead of helping you? And then work with your teams to solve the problem first. When people see that AI is here to empower them, not to replace them, the culture of adoption starts to take care of itself, right?
So important.
Chris, at the end of the day, technology will keep evolving. There will be different fire standards coming up. There more and more versions of fire will be coming up. LLM models will keep on more and more advanced. LLM models will keep on coming.
Yes.
But culture, the way we listen, include, and empower, that's what would make the difference between, hype and real transformation. And I believe every leader, including me, has the chance to be that enabler, right?
Yes. I love it. I think we've kind of come full circle and we're back to one of the most important things that you set out at the beginning. And it's a lot of listening that we need to do before we start. And I love what you're talking about and going and having the conversations with the frontline teams that are having these interactions, asking them where the workflow bottlenecks are, where are their pain points, and trying to help in those areas. And actually then delivering something that empowers them to operate at the top of their license and take some of the mundane things that are just a nuisance and taking a whole lot of time. Take that out of the equation by putting some real technology that automates those types of things that are completely mundane and rule-based, and allowing them to think, allowing them that communication with the patients and with their colleagues for a much more satisfying experience. And I think this is important for our leaders to hear this as you are leading your organization. These principles are so important because if you're engaging your teammates and your frontline staff, they're going to learn the approach that you're taking is not only about using AI for the sake of it, and it's not even about the efficiency or replacing people. It's enabling people to do the very things that should be all about in healthcare. Ratnadeep, I can't thank you enough for being my guest this week. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I know we'll continue to have some really interesting conversations in the future as things continue to evolve. And I know you and your team will be on the cutting edge, and I look forward to continuing to follow your successes.
Sure, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. It was great fun, and best of luck with the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Be sure and follow Ratnadeep and Tech Variable on LinkedIn, and go to techvariable.com to read Ratnadeep's latest white paper.
That'll do it for this episode of the Signal Room. If today's conversation sparks something in you, an idea, a challenge, a question, don't keep it to yourself. Join the conversation on LinkedIn or visit us at thesignalroompodcast.com. We're here to amplify the signals that matter across leadership, ethics, and innovation in healthcare. Until next time, stay tuned, stay curious, and stay human.